Will you talk a little bit about the connection between scaling an organization and social impact solving problem? Like, getting back to this topic, one of the things that I've seen is organizations are starting to have sort of a complementary side organization, like Action Tank or Think Tank or Research Arm, to disseminate some aspect of their work. And just want to take us inside sort of your organizations as you think about the connection between direct service, scale, and indirect influence. How do you think about it? Where do you see it being done well?
I mean, I would just say for some of the organizations we work with, you know, the most direct link is to funding. And, you know, you can have a really good public policy strategy, but at the end of the day, if it's not going to help you increase your funding, it's hard. You want to increase your impact, but you also want to, you know, manage your scarce resources, right? And so I think, again, NFP has a really great kind of public policy strategy. They work on the national level with trying to get funding out to their local sites. I think Citizen Schools also has a really great, you know, public policy agenda in the whole extended learning time venue. So it helps them broaden their impact, and they're out there and people know about them. It helps them with their growth agenda, and it also helps them, you know, eventually get more funding. So I think when all those things are bundled together, it really makes sense for an organization.
I mean, charter schools are the easy, I think, example that everybody can understand, at least to us. And if you're in an area where everybody knows what to do, and you argue there's some sort of market failure, so it's just better for the nonprofit sector to do it. I don't know, serving soup to people who need soup, right? I'm not sure there's a great benefit to scale, but in something like education, where nobody, I think, can say we absolutely know what to do, and where the problem is so large that even if you figured it out, there's always going to be a question of, is that some sort of beautiful exception that can't scale? I think that's where we see the great argument for working at least with some organizations that have the potential to get large enough, A, that they get visibility, but also that they're less prone to the charge or the real question, okay, but what does that mean for the system at large? So I would argue that even if KIPP next 100 schools aren't as good individually as 100 individual schools that might be funded, they might have an extra oomph because people can take them to policymakers and say, look, yeah, some are good, some are bad, but this is like, maybe this is really possible. And so I think we think of it, and many of the people who we might work with think of it as getting a little extra potential for influence at the systemic or policy level because of scale that you wouldn't have if you were small.
Well, I think one of the things that you were talking about that we see sometimes, and you know, we're young enough that we haven't gotten into a lot of this, but both Iris and I have models where we are getting more of your average citizens much more actively engaged with these issues. And I think for iMentor, one of our future, maybe soon, challenges will be how can we translate on the capital that generates. And I think that the other thing that we're starting to see more of, like Iris mentioned, like us trying to work together, and something that we think a lot about is we know what we do really well, and we're not going to try to do anything else. And we're hoping that we can bring in, you know, many other organizations to add to what we do, but we don't need to go out and do that for ourselves. And so I think that just being able to increase the collaboration between nonprofits is something that, you know, that can really sort of get at this more like social solution.
I just think it's so critical, actually, that each nonprofit think deliberately, actively ask themselves, should we be doing more beyond our direct service to leverage what we've learned to have a broader impact? And I think for two reasons. One, what John was saying, and you were saying about it's really expensive to scale up the traditional way of just adding a new program, or, you know, and then you need the management on top of all that. It's actually really expensive. And so we need to be thinking about, are there much more efficient ways to much more quickly accelerate reform, and to think about, again, being a game changer, not just one child or one person at a time or one school at a time. I think the other important point, though, that I think about a lot, because our model is so expensive, and I can't justify using that as my main growth engine. I actually am looking for leverage, but we're learning so much. I think any nonprofit that has a national presence, that has a pretty clear, unique value proposition or niche, vantage point, has a responsibility almost to collect deliberately what we're learning and then to figure out how to disseminate it, not hoard it. And we made a mistake up until now of not actively using that information. And so I just think we all need to think about that.
This idea of commons of information. So
Yeah.
there's this theoretical notion that there would be a place where people could go and find best practices, or they could say, how do my results stack up to others similar to me, and funders could compare results, that kind of thing. But in practice, sort of, we acknowledge the difficulties of, first of all, everyone agreeing to anything, but secondly, just the notion of how knowledge gets disseminated. So just I want to build on, Iris, what you're saying is sort of, I think there is a general attention and interest in capturing what's worked, best practices, and thinking that there's some kind of audience for that. How do you guys think about capturing, disseminating knowledge? Where do you see that working the best? Where do you go when you're trying to figure out answers to questions that you think others might have addressed?
New Teacher Project, I think, does it incredibly well. They're actually a spin-off of Teach for America. And Teach for America, I think, realized early on, wow, we need to figure out a way to more quickly accelerate reform at the district level and help districts build capacity to actually take what TFA has learned about recruitment, selection, training, support teachers, and then build their own ability to execute on that. And so the New Teacher Project was born. They ultimately spun off as a separate 501c3. But what's interesting is beyond their doing that, so their baseline motto was, we're going to partner with school districts as a consultant and help them build this internal capacity to do these practices incredibly well. And for a fee, it's a revenue generating model like Mike's. And what they've realized, they want to take it one step further. So now they've learned a ton by working with school districts and understanding, gosh, actually teacher recruitment's harder than we thought, And so they then realized, if the system can change in these 4 or 5 or 6 ways, if union contracts could change in these X, Y, and Z ways, it could radically change the whole playing field. And so they now issue reports. Tim Daly, Michelle Reed was the founder of it. She's now, as you probably know, the DC Schools Chancellor. Her replacement, one of them, Tim Daly, he's out there all the time. They do white papers, they're thought leaders. And so that for me is a classic, perfect example of how they're not hoarding everything they're learning. They're feeling a responsibility to disseminate it more broadly and to use it all up. So I just think that's good. I know TFA is thinking a lot too now about how to have a whole public policy army.
Yep.